Hello everyone, Lauren Gates here again from Sangoma Technologies with another open source pro tips video. Today's pro tips video is focusing on Node-RED and FreePBX, how we connect the two together and how we control the PBX from Node-RED. If you're familiar with this channel, I'm sure you're familiar with FreePBX already. You may not be familiar with Node-RED. Node-RED is a very powerful, very simple graphical programming interface, programming tool that allows us to connect various systems together from servers, online services, IoT devices, software, hardware, you name it, there's probably a Node-RED connection for it. We're going to walk through a simple example in this video of how we can send commands from Node-RED to the PBX and control the PBX remotely. We're not going to cover the installation of the PBX or Node-RED, so that is a prerequisite to get started. I'm running Node-RED locally on the PC here that you're looking at, but you can run it on the PBX itself if you want. You can run it on a tiny little Pi device or any of various other hardware devices or host it in some VM somewhere. It's not particularly difficult to install and set up, and there are many internet tutorials to help you with that step. So let's get started, shall we? First thing we want to do is open up Node-RED. So we go to node-red.osprotips.com on port 1880, which is the standard GUI port for a Node-RED install. First thing we see when we open it up, on the left are a vertical list of what are called nodes. I have my empty workspace here in the center of the screen, and over on the right are various different debug and other outputs that we'll walk through in a little bit. We want to install a new package, manage palette, browse to the install, and search for Asterisk. Node-RED Asterisk AMI Manager comes up. We're going to install that package, and we'll just let that installation proceed. When it's done, we can close that window, go over to the left where our nodes are, and search for AMI or Asterisk. There is now a new node in this menu. We'll grab that node, drag it to the center of the Node-RED workspace, double click on it, take a look at what our configuration options are. The name is pretty simple. We'll just put FreePBX 15 since that's what we're connecting to. The IP for my PBX or FQDN, which I'm obscuring the IP behind some imaginary FQDNs. The port, username, and password I don't have. So let us flip back to the PBX and browse to Settings, Asterisk Manager, Users. We need to create a new manager user for this connection. I click Add Manager. I'm going to call the manager name Node-RED. I am going to accept the default deny field, and I'm going to change the default permit field to wide open. Since I'm in a safe environment, in a sandbox, away from the internet, this is perfectly fine. If I was doing this on a production system, I would probably put a little more effort into my deny and permit lines to ensure that there are some security settings preventing anyone on the wider internet from exploiting this AMI connection. The second tab allows us to set which permissions this AMI user has access to. You can leave everything set to enabled, which is the default. However, I know from past experience that this will result in an extremely large amount of AMI events streaming to the Node-RED host, and that will interfere with our tutorial. So I'm going to toggle everything off except for the call events and the originate events. Going to go back And I'm going to copy the secret to the clipboard. I will submit that user and apply config. Flip back over to the Node-RED, my username, Node-RED, password, is what I previously copied to the clipboard. Events. Normally you would populate this field with a specific event or events, and that would ensure that only those events were being streamed to the Node-RED host. However, this doesn't appear to work. I've used it in the past and there doesn't appear to be any filtering, so I'm going to leave that unpopulated. The last field, port. The default port for the Asterisk AMI is 5038, but instead of guessing, there is no simple way to confirm that from the GUI, so we can go to Asterisk and we go Manager, Show Settings, where we discover that it is indeed bound to port 5038. So we'll put that in our Node-RED configuration. Click Done. Node-RED informs us with the use of this tiny blue dot on the node that this is an undeployed change. We can deploy those changes in the top right by clicking the Deploy button. And as soon as we do that, the blue dot goes away and we get a connected message at the bottom. This seems to indicate that everything is working from the point of view of Node-RED. And in fact, we can go to the command line and go Manager, Show Connected. In addition to all the local host connections that are generated by FreePBX, we see another host called Node-RED that is successfully connected. So that's a good sign. That's step one of the process, to connect Node-RED to the PBX. The next step of the process is to actually do something with this live connection. And we'll do that by putting a few more nodes on the screen, on our workspace. The first one we want to do is some mechanism to trigger the event, and we'll do that with the inject node. We can use whatever we want to trigger this event. This is a simple manual way to use the mouse to trigger it, but if I had some other means of triggering this event, I could set that up as a node as well. I'm also going to add a change node, and I'll put that between the two, and I'll space things out a little neater. And I'm going to wire these nodes together by dragging between the little connections. First, I'll take a look at the configuration options for the timestamp. I can call it whatever I want, and I can change the payload associated with this, but for our current purposes, it's irrelevant what we set this to. So we'll say that it's done. This is the node that does all the work, the change node. So we're going to call this node originate, because that's what we're going to accomplish with this node. The first thing I want to do is to delete the message payload that came from the previous trigger, which explains why we put no effort into that configuration. Then I'm going to use the set to change the payload, to add new payload options here that will be passed to the next node. So I'm going to do payload action dot action and call that originate. I use the add button at the bottom of this screen to add additional ones. Payload dot channel. And I'm going to set the channel to local 6002 at from -internal. Add another one, payload dot context. Context is from internal. I add another one, payload dot extend. Extend is *43. Add another one, payload dot priority. Priority is 1. And payload dot timeout. Timeout is 5000. let's quickly review what we've done here for this node configuration. So I've set an arbitrary name called originate. I've purged the payload that were received from the previous node, and I've set a number of new payloads, including payload action, which sends the AMI command originate. That will in turn instruct Asterisk to set up a new channel to local 6002 at from internal. That is extension 6002 in the from internal context, as all local extensions on FreePBX are. That extension will ring for a maximum duration of 5,000 milliseconds. And if there is no answer in 5 seconds, it will just terminate that channel and stop. If that channel is answered, Asterisk will then set up a new channel of context from internal with an extension of *43, a priority of 1. And when you dial a *43 of from internal context, that is the local feature code for an echo test. That is done. We click done, commit those changes. The little blue dots indicate that we have uncommitted, we have undeployed changes. So we click the deploy button in the upper right, and that's finished. Okay, let's test our originate by initiating a call to extension 6002. We actually have extension 6002 here on this system. It's a little SIP client, and it allows us to press this call trigger and see the SIP client ring. If I let it just ring and don't answer, we'll see that it immediately times out as I instructed in the originate node. Let's do that call trigger again, and this time we will answer the client here, and we should hear the familiar voice that you get when you dial *43 for the echo test.
In this mode,
there it is.
Everything you say will be repeated back to you just as soon as it is received.
We can hang that up. And of course, we're not limited to dialing feature codes. We can dial whatever we want. And we do that by editing the change node and adjusting the payload for extend. Instead of dialing *43, let's dial 6003. That corresponds to a hard phone I have here beside me on my desk, which is already registered. I can deploy that change, and I should have a video stream for that device, and there's the video stream is live. So now, when I click this call trigger, it will allow me to answer the call on local 6003, my apologies. My other phone rings. With luck, you can hear the ringing through my mic. I can answer that call. Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Hang up. In the same way that I can dial a local extension number 6003, I could also dial a PSTN number in the exact same way that I would if I was dialing it from a local device. So you could actually set up a click to call type system using this by passing a phone number through from the payload that triggers the event through to here, and actually set up a call outbound from your extension that you could use for click to dial. I'm going to cancel that change because I don't want to do that. Okay, let's expand this window again, and let us not pretend that everything works flawlessly on the first attempt. Let us go through how you quickly debug using Node-RED. So this window on the right that we've not focused much attention on, let's drag that a little wider. Let's click the little button up on the top that looks like a bug. And note that I dragged a debug node out to the middle of my workspace. Let's call this a debug. And let's wire that up to the output from the call trigger and deploy that. Note that the debug has a little green button here, so you can enable it or disable it. As long as it's enabled, all events that are piped to the debug node will be displayed in the debug window on the right. We can see that by clicking the call trigger. Fortunately, I get an incoming call from my local SIP client. We can suppress those while we'll go through the debug by just disabling that and deploying that change. So over here, we have the debug coming from the call trigger. If you recall, the call trigger config was very, very simple. It just has a payload of a timestamp. And in fact, that's what we see in the debug over here on the right. Not particularly exciting, but let's watch what happens when we do debug output coming from the change node where the originate is. If I deploy that change, clear my debug window with the little trash icon, and click the trigger once more, we get some rather different output here. Here we can inspect the payload leaving the originate, that is the change node. We can check for spelling errors and make sure things are set up the way we want. We can look at extension numbers, make sure there's nothing missing. And that is the quick and dirty introduction to debugging using Node-RED. And that's it for part one. We learned how to set up Node-RED to connect to a FreePBX system. We learned how to create a new AMI manager user using FreePBX and how to limit permissions. We learned how to send commands to the FreePBX node, and we had a very brief introduction on how to debug the Node-RED programming. Hope you enjoyed the video, and join me for part two, where we learn the next step in the process is monitoring AMI events coming from FreePBX to Node-RED. Thanks everyone, bye.